Hi everybody, my name is Hannah and this is Pepper and Pine. Today we're going over the 8th grade curriculum by Live Education. This is a Waldorf curriculum and today we're going to go through all of the books for this year. There are quite a few, as well as one additional one from grade 7. Linked in the description box below, you can find additional videos that can help support the 8th grade year if you choose to put together your own main lesson blocks or unit studies. I have additional resources that can be used either to complement this curriculum or to be used instead of it. Although, I just want to say that in all of the years that we have homeschooled, I found that whenever I would put together my own unit studies and pair it with the main lesson block, it tended to be too much information and our main lesson blocks went far too long. So I'm really excited to share with you how detailed this curriculum is and how much more user-friendly the grade 8 curriculum is in some ways than some of the other grades, or some of the other subjects. Some of the other main lesson blocks I feel like are a little bit more challenging to go through. But in 8th grade, there are a lot of history main lesson blocks, and I find those to be really easy to go through, and it's usually packed with a lot of content. In fact, for this grade level, you get 5 main lesson books on history. That is a lot, and they come with all of the content you need, which is so lovely and easy, rather than, and you'll be able to see all of the resources I have used in order to put together our main lesson blocks that are Waldorf inspired. We end up using way too many resources. It takes far too long, and it's really challenging to find those resources that are going to fit just right. So I really appreciate how much work is done so that particular passages are chosen or particular lessons. However, as with all of the Waldorf curriculum that from Live Education and with the Waldorf approach in general, since it doesn't really have a curriculum, we should be able to approach these lessons through our own understanding or through our own resources and choose the lessons that fit our families and our children. Let's begin with the introduction of 8th grade. Every year comes with a small booklet that goes through the entire approach for that grade level. And more importantly, it goes through the child development, or what you can expect with your child at that particular grade level or age level. The Waldorf curriculum is set up to support the child's development with lessons and activities that are appropriate for that child based on his or her development. So it's really important to understand what is happening with your child so that you can understand the context of these lessons. In addition to that, it's going to go through all of the main lesson blocks for the year, as well as give suggestions on how many weeks these main lesson blocks should take. And in this case, it actually gives you a possible block rotation. I follow a very different block rotation, and while I have always attempted to get our main lesson blocks down to 3 to 4 weeks, they never are in reality. Now, if they're not going to be 3 to 4 weeks for you either, then the best thing to do is to actually break it up into 2, and in some cases 3 main lesson blocks so that you can get through that content in short, like a month or less, rather than dragging that entire main lesson block out for several weeks until everyone is thoroughly exhausted and just can't wait to finish. You really want to finish these main lesson blocks where there's still anticipation and you haven't worn out the child. And truly, it's actually better to break up these longer main lesson blocks, and even if they're not that long, it's better to break them up into 2 main lesson blocks so that you have time in between to have another subject area and really let that information settle, digest, and be processed by the student. So the possible block rotation for 8th grade begins with a science main lesson block, followed by a history, followed by a science again. It includes Thanksgiving break and winter break and spring break. Now, as a homeschooler, you have more flexibility in when you are doing your lessons, and a lot of times, because if you look at the middle school curriculum, especially once you get to 8th grade, there is a lot of content. So having talked to the publishers of this curriculum, I have two things to share with you on how to break up such a lengthy approach or such a lengthy curriculum, and some tips on how you can do this. The first thing is that you don't need to do 36 weeks of school. You certainly can do 40 weeks of school, and therefore you could get all of your material in. However, the writers of this curriculum intended for the 8th grade curriculum to be written in such a way, it's so robust, it's so full, it was written in such a way that it can be used very easily, and I can attest to this, over 2 years. So into 9th grade. We have consistently treated our 9th grade year as an 8th grade year. And then 10th grade is like the beginning of high school for us. And then my children tended to test out early and go directly to community college. So the content in all of this is very approachable to do over 2 years. And if you want to include anything different for 9th grade, if you're going to follow that, I would include another resource for algebra. The introduction to algebra, I believe, is part of the 7th grade curriculum. And I don't see it in the 8th grade curriculum. And I don't think there's anything beyond the introduction to algebra. I don't introduce algebra in 7th grade. Maybe some pre-algebra. I do algebra late 8th grade or 9th grade. And if I'm doing it in 8th grade, it's a very gentle approach and more like, say, shoring up all of your pre-algebra skills before moving into algebra in high school. The introduction to algebra, if I can just flip through this book to show you a little bit, I found it a little bit challenging to bring algebra in the Waldorf way because the elementary and middle school years between 7 and 14 are a time when you're bringing lessons in the imagination and very, very much picture driven. Since algebra is more of an abstract math, I prefer to bring algebra in the 9th grade year, so definitely post-puberty and more into that 14-15 year age range, so that the mental development and the child being in their thinking stage of development rather than in their feeling stage of development tended to work better with algebra. However, I did bring Key to Algebra in 8th grade, and if you look at those materials, it has a very gentle approach. It's not abstract, and it's not trying to bring in abstract concepts through an imaginative description of those concepts, and it really aims to do pre-algebra to really shore up those skills in preparation for algebra. 8th grade algebra and 9th grade algebra differ in their rigor and their approach. So you might do a basic introduction to algebra in middle school, but really bring up the rigor and the challenge in 9th grade. This particular book does approach algebra in that imaginative pictorial way. And for me, I found that a little bit more challenging in trying to bring those concepts to my students. And so I decided not to use this book except maybe once before I realized that because I have such a hard time absorbing the way that they're teaching algebra, I had an even more difficult time trying to teach it. The proposed block rotation for 8th grade differs a lot from the way that I do my block rotation. So I'll share a little bit of why I do mine the way I do and how it's worked for us so far. Generally, and now having talked to teachers who are in the classroom, some of this advice really only works if you are a homeschooler and your children are not, say, a little bit on the younger side of each grade level. My children tended to be on the older side of each grade level purposefully because we tended to not start until they were definitely fully 7, sometimes even 8, which meant that every grade level they were really ripe and ready for the content. So we began with, in general, we like to begin with a math main lesson block and an English or literature, or maybe not literature, but grammar main lesson block. Grammar and math tend to be the first two main lesson blocks that I like to begin the school year with, because it brings a lot of new learning that the students can then practice throughout the year, especially in grammar, since they're going to be writing so much for their main lesson blocks, having that new grammar. And by 8th grade, you're really not doing grammar anymore. You're approaching language arts differently now that a lot of the foundation of grammar and writing and comprehension and reading have been set. Now you can actually have fun with that content. You can look at stories and literature and poetry and compose your own stories and your short stories, or really start to understand or debate or interpret the poetry. You can write your own poetry. So all of those delightful lessons must come or should come after the foundations are set. Not that you still can't enjoy poetry when the children are young, and in fact that is part of the curriculum, but the grammar lessons mostly are finished. There's still going to be some vocabulary and spelling, but a lot of the grammar rules the children know. The exception might be on technicalities with essay writing or research papers. So I tend to do grammar and math at the beginning of the school year to introduce those new concepts that my children will practice for the rest of the school year. In the winter time, we like to do our history, and this is a good time to bring in literature as well. And while handwork is a year-round or an all-year subject, I do prefer, for some reason, it tends to pair very well with our history and our literature to do our handwork, especially if I've taught my children a new skill and now they're set to it. It tends to be a nice way to have some handwork while we're doing our history lessons or reading classics or anything with literature. So I will do those subject areas in the winter. And then in the spring, we do our science. Now, always we tend to be behind. There hasn't ever been a year where this has worked out perfectly and we've gotten all of our subject areas done at the time that I expected. So always we have an additional or a pending or an incomplete science main lesson block that carries over from the spring into the fall, which from a climate perspective actually works really well for us, since our falls in Southern California tend to be really warm and we have long days. It seems appropriate. So we've added a lot of times a science main lesson block at the beginning of the year. Okay, this book is definitely one that you don't want to overlook. It is packed with other information on how to put together your main lesson blocks. For instance, how long the opening activities are, review, the lesson presentation, and the lesson activity. And I actually switched these around, put the lesson presentation after the lesson activity. So it's going to have all of these tips, especially if you're new to Waldorf or you're unfamiliar with how the main lesson blocks and the main lesson occur. It is different than a typical lesson. It does take into account this threefold attribute, this head, heart, and hands that has been prevalent since the very beginning in early childhood education and in grade 1. It still takes that into account as the teacher presents the lessons, even in grade 8. So going through to understand this particular approach is really helpful if you haven't had any familiarity with the Waldorf approach. And then the other thing that this is going to help you is understanding like how many weeks to do each of these main lesson blocks. Sometimes it will include additional materials that can be helpful, and just the general materials that you're going to need that are not included with the curriculum, such as your main lesson book, crayons. In this particular year, you're going to need charcoal rather than crayons. You're still going to need color pencils. You may even include some veil painting, which means you'll need your watercolors and watercolor paper and watercolor brushes. So this is going to go through to give you all of that info. Okay. Let's get started with the actual main lesson blocks. The first 2 books that I want to share with you, actually 3 books, are for language arts. And this is the Wish, Wonder, and Surprise approach to literature and creative writing for grade 8. So at this point, we are done looking at the grammar and basic comprehension, writing structure, spelling, etc. Now we can really enjoy some of the other things that those skills can provide for us. Now in all the lessons, you're going to see that there is still an emphasis on art and the visual expression by the student as well as the teacher. The teacher is still welcome to do chalk drawings or use another medium to share the artistic approach to these lessons. But the concept of wish, wonder, and surprise, which is the title of this main lesson block, goes deeper. It actually represents a modality or a particular way of viewing the world. So let me break this down for you a little bit so that we can understand not just why it's placed at this age in the curriculum, but why it's so important for us to understand this and bring it to the students. So there are three, they're not quite emotions because emotions are more fleeting, but they're more a way to view the world. And these modes are basically modalities of human experience, and they are aspiration or wish, and the other one is a sense of wonder. So I have my own notes as well. As a Muslim family, I'm always looking for ways to bring about lessons that are culturally and religiously significant for us. And so if you're familiar with other approaches, other religions, other cultures, you might interpret some of these things to suit your particular values. So for us, I added prayer along with wish. And with wonder, for me, it's also a sense of awe and reverence, which has been a theme throughout all of the years in the Waldorf approach. But at this stage, as children are now had reached puberty, or they're in their adolescence, or they're approaching that next developmental change at around 14, I think a deeper contemplation of God is appropriate at this age, and it will only get stronger until I shouldn't say it only gets stronger, but at around 16 years old, the student will go through another awakening. There have been 3, conscious awakenings throughout the early, middle, and adolescent years. So early childhood, the elementary years, and then high school. At around age 3, you have the awakening to the self. So this would be when the child develops their I. They don't call themselves in the third person anymore. They say I. Around 9, with the 9-year change, you have the awakening to the world. The child no longer feels connected or one with the world, rather. They feel separate, and it's the beginning of who am I? Who am I in this world? What can I do? And that theme continues. And at around 16, the student goes through a bit of a spiritual awakening. They're seeking a greater truth, and they're contemplating the meaning of life. And so bringing in a spiritual faculty into this lesson, which with literature and language arts might seem ill-placed, actually has a deep significance. So a sense of wonder, I would include an awe and reverence personally, and then an astonishment or surprise of the unexpected. This is really interesting. So these 3 modalities, let me explain a little bit further so that we can actually kind of understand surprise, because children experience surprise all the time when they're young, but that surprise tends to go away. And I'll use a very simple example. The first time a child mixes yellow with blue and it creates green, there is such an excitement and a surprise. That feeling is it doesn't last. We're not thinking that every time we mix colors. And maybe some people are, but the opportunity for surprise certainly goes down quite a bit. I have a story about that. Let me see if I can remember. But let's move on to understanding these 3 different modalities. So wish, wonder, and surprise. So wish is something that you aspire to. It's a longing for what could be, and it really embodies our hopes and ideals. And this is a function of the future. So when we're wishing for something, we can imagine our orientation is that of the future. Wonder, however, is in the present. Wonder is our sense of awe, curiosity, and general openness to the world. This is a time when I think that if you are a religious person, bringing in science and religion is perfect time at this moment, because when we are looking at nature or at astronomy, when we have wonder and also a general appreciation for that, we're seeing through science even deeper wonders that maybe just our observations as individuals would miss. And this is a time when the spirituality of having this appreciation for this and a greater creator, a greater maker for this is a great time to combine this opportunity of observation with a sense of reverence, and that would be the wonder. And this is very much in the present. This is the orientation you could imagine, very much in the present. Okay, surprise. This orientation is towards the unexpected. Surprises actually probably happen more than we think, but we don't attribute necessarily a negative surprise as something that we would hope for. We hope, and we might not even be thinking and hoping for surprises, but we are certainly not wanting, anticipating, or hoping for a negative surprise. So negative surprises would be something that would cause, sadness or grief or some other kind of emotion that is different than the astonishment that would come from surprise that we are trying to illuminate and also recognize that students of 13, 14, and really even into high school, there is this desire for surprise in the same capacity that as these students are growing, maturing, they're going through adolescence, they've gone through puberty, there is this new development for exploration and discovery, which includes surprise. It's part of the unknown. And we're going to see later in the other subject areas how the age of exploration and discovery are exactly that phenomena that is happening on a grand scale that is mirrored with the 8th grade student. So these are not emotions. Wish, wonder, and surprise are not considered emotions in this context. They are ways that we orient ourselves in the world. So these versus like emotions being feelings. This is a mode of how, it's like a lens of how we're going to see the world. So these 3 experiences shape how we perceive reality. So I hope that gives you like a general understanding of these 3 modalities as part of this main lesson block for literature. I do want to say one more thing, some notes that I took on this, and I'll go back to surprise actually. But philosophy was born out of wonder and is a faculty of the soul, because wonder goes beyond the intellect or the imagination. So the children at this stage are still, while they're in their intellect, they're still in their somewhat imaginative or pictorial sense of lessons and view. Their thinking is still pictorial and imaginative. At around 14, it shifts, and now they can think in the abstract, critical thinking, intellect. Their intellect has matured. They reason and logic. All of those cognitive abilities are part of the older adolescent or the adolescent student in high school. At this age, that child of 18 or that student of 13, 14 in 8th grade, the student of 8th grade is right at that cusp. So there will be some students who are ready for some more intellectual content, but regardless, they still love surprise. I'm going to bring you 2 examples. So many years ago, I met a woman, and by this point, having ultrasounds to find out whether your baby was a boy or a girl, or even how many babies you were having, was very commonplace, and it still is today. But it was even more commonplace back then. I think now maybe some people choose not to find out, and she chose not to find out. And when I asked her, and also I should just say, we chose not to find out either with our 4 children. And I had my own reasons for not finding out, but I was curious to hear about her reasons. And she said, in a world where we have so few surprises, I want to leave something to the unknown. And I thought that was really great that she actually had a choice. Now that's a little bit different because there's still an anticipation of a birth of a child. So I would say that it's not quite the same experience as something completely unexpected, because there is still an expectation to that, but I still appreciated the thought and the insight and the forethought, really, to want something that was unknown, to preserve something that was unknown for them. Now, some children and some temperaments especially really love surprises and things that are spontaneous, let's say, or things that are changing, and there's always like a new discovery because things are constantly changing. So that is the sanguine temperament. Now, all of childhood is a sanguine time. So they're moving through their feelings more rapidly than at an older age. Every day is like a new day. Very little really remains that as in comparison to us as adults or in our teenage years. The idea of something being a surprise, or I should say maybe spontaneous, because I can control the spontaneity to create a surprise for my children, for instance. Now, this does not work for every child. Some children absolutely do not like surprises. So you really have to understand or know your child really well to know whether bringing a surprise, like you curating or crafting a surprise, is going to be a positive thing or not. I have one child who especially loves spontaneity and surprises, good surprises. And I happen to really not like spontaneity and surprises. Very, very much so. I don't like them. So, I mean, there certainly could be some exceptions, but overall, the times that I have brought the most joy to my child who likes surprises is when I dispense with the ordinary and I say, let's do something out of the ordinary. Let's go out and get matcha. Let's go take a trip, or let's not do the meal that I had planned. Let's go out to eat, or let's go visit so-and-so. Whatever it is, the amount of joy that is on her entire body, not just on her face, reminds me how important it is that we still have this quality of surprise. So sometimes an adult or a teacher can cultivate that, and sometimes life just offers it. Since we know that this particular grade is going to especially appreciate and like and need the surprises, the teacher can craft surprises for the classroom, and bringing that in is going to bring a lot of joy to the students. So let me explain to you the lesson, because the main lesson is slightly different. It still follows the same 2 to 3 day rhythm. The curriculum talks a lot about the 2-day rhythm. I prefer a 3-day rhythm, and there is reason behind why it is a 2-day rhythm, because it's technically a little bit more than 2 days, but as that would be impossible to do, a 2.5-day rhythm. A lot of times classes will do a 2-day rhythm. I much prefer the 3-day rhythm. So I'll explain a little bit about the difference, but let me share with you how the literature main lesson block differs a little bit from the other main lesson blocks. You're going to be doing 3 activities. There is the recitation of poetry, stories, or literary passages. There's the discussion of the issues related to the literature, and this is so fun to do. It's so exciting, and certainly you could be having discussions when the children are younger. But now that the students have reached puberty, and some of them may already have the new capacity for thinking, the discussions at this age are so deep, so profound, and so insightful. So the discussions of the issues related to the literature or interpretation and speculation. And the last thing is a composition of stories, poetry, and don't forget to include the visual arts in your lessons. So that could be painting or drawing. And there is another main lesson for chalk drawing. So I'll explain why we're bringing chalk drawing in at this age, because up until this point, although there was perspective drawing in grade 7, so I think prior to grade 7, if I remember correctly, it was all the arts were in colors. And then with perspective drawing with pencil, now you're just looking at gray and white or black and white. And then now with charcoal, again, you're looking with black and white, and of course, all the shades in between. The teachers should remember to bring memorization work for the students, especially in poetry. Children will have been memorizing poetry and verses since they were very young, even before they were required to memorize. They were memorizing naturally in kindergarten, for instance, with nursery rhymes or something similar. And so we want to remember to bring that in and build on it so that the students have a store of literature and poetry for them to access in the future. So this book includes the passages that you're going to find in the reader. So there are two books that are incredibly similar. This one is much smaller, but this one includes, unless I'm mistaken, because I went through them and it looked like all of the passages were the same, but this book is going to include the passages that the teacher can prepare. So here's the important part to know. Again, with a Waldorf curriculum, there really isn't a standardized curriculum. It's really important that the teacher brings the lessons that are meaningful to them. However, it can be very challenging if you haven't gone through any Waldorf teacher training to figure out what would those lessons be. So I really appreciate this curriculum because it's going to bring you all of the resources. However, it is the bare bones. You really need to do your own learning. You need to do your own memorizing. If you stand before the students and you haven't learned this content, they're going to internalize that if you don't know it and it's not important to you, why should it be important to me? There are a few different themes in this book. So you have the theme of wonder, you have amazement and surprise and wonder again. And within them are several selections. I think there are 19 selections in all that you can choose from, and you don't need to go in order. You can pick and choose, you can go out of order, and the lessons include the content, which you are not just to read aloud. However, in some cases, you do need to read aloud versus retelling because these are literary passages, so you do need to read these passages. However, it can't just end there. You actually have to engage with the students and really come to it having been prepared. But the curriculum is also going to go over some lesson activities, and the curriculum is packed with illustrations as well that can be used as inspiration for you as the teacher for your to illustrate so the students can then copy. The reader includes all of the passages and poetry. It's a much smaller book, but it is already contained in the main lesson book. The next main lesson block includes charcoal drawing and the art of storytelling. Art has been a theme throughout all the years and even into high school, but all the years of elementary school, students have done an artistic representation for either every lesson or for every few lessons. There has been some kind of artistic representation of that lesson. But in those lessons, they were not art lessons necessarily. They were expressions of the lesson. An art lesson is different. Explain how to hold the tool or imagine for this particular drawing, like where's the light source coming from? Where would the shadow be? These lessons now bring in a new art medium, that of charcoal, that you can use on white paper, or you can use white charcoal on dark paper, either almost a black paper, or you can even use, say, a green toned gray paper I've used in the past as well. And there's reason why we're bringing in this somewhat of a polarity at this stage. In fact, the idea of polarity, the theme rather of polarity, has existed since, I believe, grade 1. And that theme has sort of shifted throughout all of the years, but it still remained. So we have, say, the synthesis of lessons versus the analysis of lessons. We have sympathy and antipathy, and of course, light and dark, which you're going to see in charcoal drawings. So in perspective drawing in the year before, this was using math and particular skills and instruction for a particular art medium, or rather an art approach, that would be perspective drawing. Now we're going to do the same with charcoal. Up until that point, if we did watercolors, they weren't necessarily lessons in how to watercolor. We simply watercolored as part of our lesson. And it's not to say there still isn't instruction, but the purpose of the lesson wasn't an art lesson necessarily. The purpose of the lesson was an artistic representation of the content of the lesson. So in this book, you're going to have a lot of examples of different charcoal drawings that can complement the short stories that are suggested. There are references or resource links for the books that are suggested, but really in this way, the authors of this curriculum are suggesting a type of story so that you have lots of choices. You can do the ones that are inspiring to you, but they have suggested a few resources, and these charcoal drawings are based on the resources that are provided. Okay, let's dive into history. Now, first I have to explain that history really became a main lesson block in grade 6 with the Middle Ages and Rome. And then in grade 7, we had like the Age of Discovery. And then here in grade 8, we have from the early, let's do this in order actually. We have early American history, history of the 19th century, 20th century, this probably comes first, revolutionaries and romantics. Oh gosh, we have ancient China. Where are we going to stick that? Let me talk to you about ancient China in a minute. But you have 5 main lesson blocks on history for this year. History, really recorded history. You can argue that it was with the ancient civilizations, but really the recorded history that is taught from, say, a historical perspective begins in about grade 6 with the Waldorf approach, with the ancient civilizations being in grade 5. Prior to that, the focus was on mythologies. And prior to that, we looked at religious texts like the Old Testament or the saints. And before that, we did the fables and Native American legends. And then before that, we had the fairy tales. So if you're looking at this how you travel down this path of history, which isn't really history if you're looking at the fairy tales, but you're looking at these stories that have particular themes, messages, and lessons, but the history will not be developmentally appropriate for the student until for sure after the 9-year change, but really it's after puberty. So with puberty, with this development of understanding cause and effect and consequences and having a better relationship with time having a relationship with time really began with the 9-year change. Prior to that, students lived without any limitation on their time. Time was eternal. Every day was spread ahead of them as if it wasn't going to end. After the 9-year change, students understand time, and that's when grammar is taught in the lessons. Prior to that, it's not going to land well because they're not developmentally ready for that. But history, recorded history, especially the history that's going to affect that student today in modern history, is taught in 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. So you have so much emphasis and so many main lesson blocks on history. Actually, you start in grade 5. In grade 5 with the ancient civilizations, you actually have, I think it's mostly history in grade 5 with a little bit of science. There's so much history. Okay, so for the history for the 8th grade, actually, let me talk about ancient China. So this ancient China main lesson block was added actually after I had purchased the curriculum. And so I did not have this with the rest of the main lesson block. So this was sent to me separately. Now, we never went through this particular main lesson block in its entirety. We actually included ancient China when we did our Silk Road main lesson block, which was part of the same sort of time period as the Middle Ages. The Silk Road comes before. And we also did, say, a North African unit and an Islamic civilization main lesson block. So all of those main lesson blocks were complementing our Middle Ages main lesson block, so that our Middle Ages wasn't entirely Eurocentric and we observed the rest of the world at the same time. When we did that, we included our ancient China at that time because it was relevant to understanding the content that was going to come afterwards. If you wanted to do an ancient China main lesson block alongside your other ancient civilizations, you could. I just didn't find that it worked as well for me. And then here they have it in grade 8, which I feel like it could be enjoyable, but doesn't seem as appropriate as putting it with one of the other main lesson blocks. And the main lesson blocks that I did were not included in the Waldorf curriculum. Those are ones that I just brought. So this book is absolutely amazing. I learned that the author of this main lesson block traveled to China to really get a sense of the atmosphere, the environment, the architecture, and everything before he wrote this main lesson block. So it is, in some senses, quite personal to the experience of the writer, but especially authentic. So that is a main lesson block that you can see. And of course, the little tags that I have added are my own. I put them according to color. There is a color theme year by year for the students, in the sense that the classrooms are painted a particular color, and it evokes a similarity or a reflection to the mode or the feeling that the student has. So in the younger years, there's a lot more warmth and togetherness and closeness, and the first graders are all huddled around the teacher quite a bit more. By 8th grade, they have moved apart. There's a lot more coolness and bit of criticism and skepticism and questioning, and so the colors of the room reflect that. And so I have added the colors because on the side, otherwise you would not be able to distinguish what the books are. And so for my organization, I added these tabs. So this one was added later, therefore it does not have that tab. They don't come like this, and they don't come like this for a reason, because these main lesson blocks are not intended to just be used with 8th grade. It could be used with 7th grade. It could be used with 9th grade. And since some of these topics come back again in high school, you certainly could use these resources again in high school. So we're going to have the revolutions and romantics. Then we move into the early American history. And then we have American history of the 19th century. And this is, oh, wait, we have one more, 20th century, because we really need to get it into modern times. So I'm going to just give you a basic understanding of all of these main lesson blocks. To begin with, I want to say that there are chosen lessons, which are so helpful. This is one of the more user-friendly main lesson blocks. I think that sometimes the science main lesson block can be difficult if you're trying to put together your demonstrations. And sometimes the math main lesson block can be challenging if you're not used to a particular style of teaching the math concepts, which of course the Waldorf curriculum or the Waldorf approach has their own approach for teaching math. When it comes to history, I find that the history main lesson blocks are the ones that are the most user-friendly, because in almost every case, I think in every case, they actually provide a really well-written lesson. Now, we're supposed to read the lesson. I'll just tell you, you read the lesson, you digest the information, you present it to the student. This is not something that you give to the student, and this is not something that you read aloud to the student either. When you're reading this aloud to the student, they think, well, you don't know it. Why should I know it? Or why don't you know it? Why do you have to refer to the content, the book, the main lesson book? So it's important that we read these lessons ahead of time and then present them. Have I done that? Very rarely. Almost always I've read aloud. That's not the way you're supposed to do it. When I read aloud, I think that I'm doing a little more Charlotte Mason than Waldorf. However, the times that I have been prepared and I have orally presented the lesson, they have been so much better. For me, not so much for my children, because those lessons go far too long and my children completely just get tired of the lesson. But in general, I have so much more fun with it. I get so much more enthusiastic with the content. And of course, there can be tangents and other context to make it relatable. This book comes with illustrations as well. These are not all original illustrations, but they can be used as inspiration for your own chalk drawings or your own illustrations. By this stage, a lot of times I was using a main lesson book to draw the illustrations and write the content. And that would allow me to process the content so that I could present it, but also it gave my students a an abridged or summary version in case they forgot the content. They could refer back to the notes that I had made, which was written out in a narrative form. And then if we were moving on to new lessons, at least they could still see the illustration, and I didn't have to keep something up on the chalkboard or have to erase it before they were ready. And this is the nature of being in a homeschool environment versus a classroom environment, where the whole class is held a little bit more to standards where you kind of just have to get it done. You have to illustrate it and move on. However, I also have to say that in most of the Waldorf classrooms that I have seen, there have been multiple chalkboards. So there's always another place to draw your illustration. Okay, I do want to say one thing about how the main lesson is presented. So again, we're looking at a 2 to 3 day cycle. I prefer the 3-day approach, but regardless, the lesson presentation is the same. You start with your opening activities. Even though this is history, we still start with an opening activity. This just sort of gets the child or the student prepared for the lesson. I like to do things that are relevant to the topic area in some way. However, doing your, say, mental math or movement math with, like, say, some bean bags, for instance, is a really great way to start your lesson. And for us, we generally would play a game, like say a Professor Noggin's trivia game or a math game, to sort of get us into the main lesson. It's a little bit hard just to start with the content. The content usually begins with a review of the previous day's lesson, which is so important in really understanding what you learned, because you now have had one day to sleep on the content. Now you're bringing it back up to the surface. So the teacher can lead the review, or the students can just start with the review. Then there are two aspects to the lesson. There's the lesson activity or the lesson work, and then there's the new presentation. The lesson work is where the student is drawing or writing their lesson. There may be other ways to present a lesson, but in general, it includes a narration and an illustration. Then you have the lesson presentation. Now, in one of the books, it showed the lesson presentation coming before the written work or before the lesson activity. That depends on whether the lesson activity is something that is, say, you're going to do something hands-on, for instance, then it makes sense that that lesson activity is going to come afterwards. But if it's a lesson activity that's going to be writing or drawing, then I prefer to do that before, so that their will has been engaged, and now to end the lesson, your rhythmic system is engaged with the story or the presentation, which is usually story-driven. With history, the presentation of the lesson is slightly different. The beginning of the presentation usually begins with a general overview of the content, very brief, a few sentences, quite dry, quite bare. This engages either the whole body, or it also engages the thinking as well, but this is just a preview to whet the appetite. Then the lesson presentation engages the rhythmic system. The story engages the rhythmic system. Then the following day, when you are working on the lesson, that engages the will. That's the activity of the student. So once again, you see all three, willing, feeling, and thinking, being engaged in every lesson. The early American history, natives, colonists, and revolutionaries. Oh, that was misprinted. I've got two covers on that one. The importance of this particular book is not just the main lesson itself, but to understand what it means to discover this unknown territory. Now, this is subject to a lot of, say, not so much conflict as, say, controversy, because it depends on who's discovering it. Clearly, the people who lived in the United States didn't need to discover their own land. So this is told by the perspective of Europeans who have come to discover this land. And this is their story, not the story of the people who were already existing, which now hardly exist because of those people who came and explored and conquered and fought against the people who originally lived here. And that's where you can find a lot of the criticism and controversy over glorifying this exploration. When Europeans came here, and even when Europeans come here today, they are blown away by the vastness of this country, of the US. the beauty of this country. And when it was first discovered, it was quite brutal as well. The harsh living conditions, very difficult winters, very cold winters, sometimes very hot, humid summers. This was not an easy place to survive. But there was a sense of discovery, adventure, discovering the unknown, and definitely a lot of dedication and perseverance, which made these explorers have the ability to do what they did. Now, many years ago at a homeschool conference, there was a presenter who said something very fascinating about the descendants and really even the current population of the United States. She was saying that everyone who lives here now, except for a small minority of indigenous people, everyone who lives here now is from someone who immigrated here or is a descendant from someone who immigrated here. And this is fascinating because the type of person who is willing to leave everything behind, maybe even family, risk their life and whatever wealth they have or don't have, it's expensive to move countries. They did all of that for this, with determination, with perseverance, with this need to discover. All of those attributes now are consolidated into one country. So you have people who still hold a lot of those values of individualism, optimism, freedom, determination, and a certain amount of confidence that comes with trying things that are risky. When you risk and you are successful, you build your confidence, but also the amount of bravado that is required in order to do this in the first place. Now you have a whole collection of people who either are this or descendants of people who did this. Very fascinating stuff. Okay, this book is going to go through topics from 1492, so the quote-unquote discovery of America by Christopher Columbus, all the way until 1609 with Henry Hudson exploring the Hudson River. So you have about 120-ish years of content for this book, which of course has all of the lesson activities, and illustrations. American history in the 19th century. What's important to understand, I have explained it, but I'm going to reiterate it one more time, is that the 8th grade student is in their adolescence, or the very beginning of their adolescence. They have probably gone through puberty, and with that comes a certain development that these particular lessons really appeal to this student. When they are on their own personal discovery and wanting adventure and wanting the unknown, these lessons provide such rich content to help support that child's interests and support their development. So again, these main lesson books are quite thick. They have a lot of content. The stories are very robust. They are enough completely. And the one wish that I had in looking back on my 20 plus years of homeschooling is that I wish that I had just done the curriculum the way that it was intended. And I'll explain why I didn't, but I wish I had, because it is just the right amount. You're not going to exceed and make your main lesson blocks like 8 weeks long, which was pretty typical for me. But the reason why I didn't, and the reason why I included so many other resources, is because oftentimes I wasn't just teaching one child. I was teaching multiple students, multiple abilities, multiple grade levels. And this meant bringing in a variety of resources like picture books and activity books, or games like the Professor Noggins games, or other books and, say, biographies and chapter books and things like that. It was because I was teaching multiple children, and that was going to appeal to each of those grade levels a little bit better. But truly, I wish that I had just done this and done the lesson for the oldest child and let every other student get what they get out of the lesson. I really wish that I had done it more like that. World history, I definitely wouldn't have done this with the really young children. This is something I would have just presented to the older children, but in reality, I never got to world history in 8th grade. It was always in 9th or 10th grade, and more realistically, it wasn't until 10th grade that we really got into world history, and we would use the resource The Story of Us or The Story of the US by Joy Hakim, and that was the main resource that we use in order to bring my students up to the modern world, so that we had an overview from basically, I think maybe Renaissance area time period or Age of Discovery time period, all the way into the modern world. And actually, it would have done the discoverers, but I think it did more of, like, say, the indigenous people at that time period. So once again, you're going to do the 2 to 3 day rhythm. If you're going to do a 2-day rhythm, you're going to do the lesson presentation with the lesson work from the previous day on one day. And then the next day, you are moving forward while still doing your review and the main lesson work from the previous day. For the 3-day rhythm, the rhythm that I prefer, you're doing lesson work and presentation and illustration, and that's why it takes 3 days. The review is going to be part of it as well, but the review works into the lesson work because you're reviewing and then you're writing down. Or you can review one day and write down the next day. And when you do your review, you can do your illustration. So you have one more day to process the information. Okay, the last subject area is the science main lesson blocks for grade 8. Now, the middle school years involves so much science. You have physics, you have chemistry, you have anatomy, physiology and nutrition, you have astronomy, and there may be one other main lesson block that I'm missing. There is a dramatic difference in the middle school science main lesson blocks versus the previous couple of years. In 4th and 5th grade, you had the living sciences of zoology, which is the man and animal main lesson block, and the biology, which is really botany, and that was the botany main lesson block in grade 5. Now, with grades 6, 7, and 8, you're looking at the mineral kingdom. Oh yeah, mineralogy was the other one that I forgot. You're looking at the mineralogy kingdom, or the mineral kingdom, through mineralogy, through astronomy. So these are like I don't like calling them the dead sciences, but they're certainly not the living sciences. But the phenomena that is associated with these sciences is amazing. And that's the focus of how to present these lessons. So now, actually the weather one I've never done because this was a newer addition. So it's weather, climate, physics, and history, which of course I love when all of the subject areas are rolled into one particular approach. But I want to talk to you more about this particular chemistry main lesson block. There is a separate physics main lesson block for 8th grade if you're using different resources, because physics is brought in 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. It begins with optics, thermodynamics, so heat, light, and sound is the first main lesson block, heat, light, and sound. Then you move into electricity and magnetism, and then I believe in 8th grade it's forces and something else. I can't remember at the moment. So there is this particular trajectory. I think in the Waldorf, this particular curriculum by Live Education, it's 2 years, and so all those lessons are brought in those 2 years. And so bringing in physics with weather is a very interesting approach. I like that a lot. It is advised that you do your anatomy after you do your chemistry main lesson block, but in the case of chemistry and physics, the lesson approach is now really different. So the way that you're going to approach your lesson, and also this main lesson block as the other main lesson blocks, they begin with explaining the child development, the approach of this main lesson block, the materials that you're going to need, and how the teacher should deliver the lessons. So all of the main lesson blocks are going to provide that content before jumping into the lessons themselves. The way the lessons are done for chemistry and physics is that you are presenting the phenomena, and then you are recapitulating that experience the following day. The precision with the apparatus describing what is happening is very important for the lesson. We're still presenting these in an imaginative way, but we're being very precise and accurate with the descriptions. So when we are explaining like the beakers that we're using or the combustible sources that we are using, we're being accurate with the size, the description, And in some cases, you might even use a lab book, but in most cases, you can still use your main lesson book. In all cases, the main lesson books, they do get smaller, but this curriculum still advises with the 9 inches by 12 inches, I believe, for all of them. It was definitely suggested the 9 inches by 12 inches for the literature main lesson block. I prefer the 9 inches by 12 inches with blank pages, but by middle school, you can find the main lesson books that are a little bit smaller, that include lined pages and fewer blank pages for the illustration. I still prefer to have blank pages on both sides, but my children absolutely do. None of my children ever liked the blank pages when it came to writing, and they would include their own lines into the pages, and they much prefer to have pages with lines. So there's that as well. But I prefer having the flexibility of the blank pages so that we can do our writing. If someone writes big or small, you're not confined to the lines on the page. So the way that you're doing your demonstrations is very different than an experiment. An experiment is testing for something. There's like a theory, there's a hypothesis, but with the demonstration, you still can have those thoughts, so like what's going to happen. But in general, you are observing the phenomena, which works really well with that wish, wonder, and surprise, because here is an opportunity to really bring surprise. We're not sure how these materials are going to react when they're combusted. We're not sure how these chemicals are going to react when they're mixed together. We're not sure what's going to precipitate out when we are when we're working with acids and bases. So all of that brings about another opportunity for wish, or rather for surprise, that the students have been getting all along, but now they have another opportunity to do this. So the main lesson book for chemistry is going to go through combustion, acids and bases, the salt forming process, and then solutions, solvents, and catalysts. Next, we have human anatomy and physiology. The nutrition, and I suppose you could even consider it, well, nutrition and hygiene come in grade 7. You could also include physiology because that's more of a living science. Anatomy, the way it's presented here, is more, you're looking at the bones at this point, but this comes after the other processes have been understood. So there's a lot with, here's going to go through the senses, but there's a lot of the basis of understanding this is understanding the human being, its needs, its rhythmic system, its nervous system, and the circulatory system, all of those. And it's also, again, looking at that threefold nature. We're seeing that again in the human form. And then you have the more the anatomy, which is a little bit drier, but still just as fascinating. So once again, you have the beautiful illustrations and the content. When we did our anatomy main lesson block, we did not do the grade 7 or grade 8. This was newly sent to me. You can tell I don't have the tags on these or the little labels on these because these were additions that were added after I purchased my curriculum. So they were sent to me so that I can present them today along with the other main lesson blocks for grade 8. But when we did our main lesson block for anatomy, I actually used a different resource that went through all of the lessons, a little bit different, and it did not include illustrations. We use other resources for illustrations, but at least all of this has the illustrations that you need. And in some cases, when you can see them hand-drawn with color pencils, I actually prefer this because the medium that we typically use is color pencil as well, and having an illustration in the medium that I'm going to use is far easier than looking at an illustration from a book, a computer generated illustration, or an illustration, or maybe not even an illustration, maybe it's a photograph. I find those really difficult for me to copy and turn into an illustration for my students, and so I really appreciate having these illustrations in this book. All right, let's do the last one, which we already sort of like alluded to earlier, and that is weather, climate, physics, and history. And for this particular main lesson block, I can't tell you too much about it since we did not cover this particular main lesson block. And when we did weather, we might have done it with our earth science, mineralogy, and geology main lesson block more so because we found that the weather really affected the landscape. So we used those concepts a little bit more, but this goes into far more depth, and I like that it includes some history. And in all cases in science, we should definitely include some biographies because it's so important to know these particular scientists and philosophers that made these discoveries in the first place. I hope you enjoyed this look at the Waldorf Grade 8 curriculum by Live Education. Don't forget to check out the blog post that accompanies this video, where you can find more information as well as other videos that support the 8th grade year. And if you'd like to see how we're homeschooling on a daily basis, you can find me on my website at pepperandpine.com.